Frank Newman was an ordinary man leading a simple, measured life. There was nothing special about his habits. Work, a small circle of friends, rare trips to nature. Calm, even a little introverted, he always tried to stay away from any risk. His life proceeded in a routine, monotonous rhythm, and probably everything would have continued like this if it hadn't been for the tragedy that occurred in the spring. That day, he was going on a weekend trip, the first time in a long time that he decided to leave the city. He was waiting for her with a rare excitement for him. He wanted to distract himself, change the situation, and just see how people live in other places. But the trip was suddenly cancelled. The night before, a call informed him that an accident had occurred. Two of his colleagues who worked with him on a previous project had been found dead in their apartment. The police did not disclose details, and only one short news report indicated that the death occurred under strange circumstances. Frank was stunned, but did not yet suspect that this was just the beginning of a series of events that would gradually destroy his quiet life. A couple of days after the tragedy, he was called to a police interview to clarify the details of a work project in which he participated with the victims. Frank found himself in the office of Detective Ellison, a dry, gloomy, middle-aged man who asked the same questions several times. "Did you know that their behavior has changed in recent months?" the detective asked, glaring at him. Episodes flashed through Frank's memory. One of his colleagues started having trouble sleeping, the other became irritable and nervous. It was blamed on stress, a common thing in their field, but at that moment Frank began to think that not everything was so simple. Frank tossed and turned for a long time that night, thinking about what had happened. He began to have a strange feeling, as if someone was watching him, despite the empty apartment. The following week, he learned from colleagues that the victims had had panic attacks in recent days. They talked about strange noises at night and the feeling that someone was watching them. It left him confused. Why didn't anyone pay attention to their complaints? Why did they die at exactly the same time? Frank became more and more withdrawn, tormented by thoughts of what this case was hiding. It's been a few weeks. Returning home one day after a night shift, he decided to take a little rest before going back to work. But something strange happened that night. He woke up in the middle of the night, barely falling asleep, and couldn't bring himself to fall asleep again. All he could hear was his own breathing echoing in the silence, as if there was something alien somewhere very close by, something that was bothering him. His condition worsened every day. He began to wake up in a cold sweat, lying on the sweat-soaked sheets, feeling an inexplicable fear cover him. Sometimes he woke up with the feeling that someone was imperceptibly breathing on his face, standing next to him and disappearing the moment he opened his eyes. In the last week of insomnia, when Frank was almost losing track of time, he had a clear idea that he might face the same problems as his dead colleagues. Frank began to avoid sleeping at night. It seemed to him that if he fell asleep, he would wake up in fear or not wake up at all. He stopped going to work, focusing only on staying up at night. His face was haggard, dark circles under his eyes treacherously indicated a prolonged sleepless state, but he did not want to share this with anyone. His life turned into an endless series of nights and days that merged into a single painful expectation. One day, while sitting at home watching videos, he came across a documentary about similar cases of insomnia and unexplained fear that overtakes victims just at night. It was about a rare disorder that affects people in moments of severe stress, which gradually leads to the fact that a person is afraid to fall asleep, no matter what happens to him. Frank recognized himself in the symptoms described: paranoia, the feeling that he was being watched, auditory and visual hallucinations, plunging him into a state of panic. But the most frightening thing was that in some cases this disorder turned out to be irreversible. Overwhelmed by the new information, he tried to find contacts of those who survived such episodes, but everywhere he found only mentions of the deaths of people who could not find a way out of this horror. Frank contacted Detective Ellison, the only one who knew the details of the case of the dead colleagues. When they met, he asked if the police had any information about the strange symptoms they had experienced before their deaths. Ellison must have suspected something was wrong for a long time, because he answered without hesitation: they were all afraid to sleep. One of them left a diary where he described waking up every night with the feeling that he was being strangled. Frank turned pale. He was experiencing the same symptoms himself. For several more weeks he avoided sleep, living in a state of constant terror. He was almost certain that once he fell asleep, he would suffer the same fate as his colleagues. One night, unable to stand any more paranoia and fatigue, he passed out right at the table. The dream, if it could be called that, fell on him with all its weight. His body seemed to be paralyzed, his arms and legs became motionless, and watching the darkness around him, he felt a strange weight fall on him. Frank was sure that this was the beginning of the end. When he woke up, he felt a sticky cold. His room was empty, but something had changed. The shadows seemed longer, as if they were stretching towards him, eagerly stretching towards him. He couldn't figure out if this was reality or the fruit of his exhausted mind. Frank went to a psychiatrist, hoping to find an explanation. The doctor diagnosed severe night terror syndrome. He was prescribed strong sedatives and advised to return to a normal routine. Frank started treatment, but even powerful drugs did not bring the long-awaited relief. The horror of the nights grew stronger, and the familiar walls of his apartment seemed to shrink like a vice. He woke up every night with a new thought that something was obviously wrong. All the medications caused him either severe weakness or nightmares so realistic that sometimes he could not distinguish them from reality. Walking down the corridor to the bathroom in one of these nightmares, he suddenly froze in horror. A man with a crazy expression on his face, haggard, with inflamed eyes, was looking at him from the reflection in the mirror. Frank was amazed at the extent to which he had already changed. It was easier during the day, but as soon as evening came, the tension returned. After several nights of fear, he had already stopped distinguishing between reality and his own illusions. Frank began to look for any ways to distract himself. He spent hours reviewing the news, reading books and articles, and studying forums where people described similar conditions. Among them were mentions of something very similar. Dozens of people described almost identical symptoms: sleep paralysis, frightening hallucinations, fear of what happens at night. Many, like him, were on the verge of despair, not knowing who else to turn to for help. One night, when he was completely exhausted, there was a knock on his door. The thought flashed through his head. Who could it be at this hour? As he struggled to the door, he saw Allison on the threshold. The detective looked no better than Frank himself. His eyes were empty and gloomy. "Frank," he began quietly, "we have more information about your colleague's case." Ellison said that the police studied the last weeks of their lives and found a strange common feature. They were all trying to get rid of sleep. Someone took stimulants. Someone even set himself an alarm clock every half hour to prevent himself from falling into a deep sleep. At some point, they became obsessed with the idea of avoiding sleep at all costs. The reason was a feeling of constant surveillance and paranoia, which, according to them, arose only at night. Frank listened, unable to tear himself away. Ellison said that the day before their deaths, they began to keep a joint diary, where they recorded their feelings. This diary was the key to solving their fears. There they described similar dreams, dreams in which they found themselves in a windowless room, feeling that they could not move or even scream. They gasped and woke up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that someone was standing by their bed. Ellison handed Frank a copy of these notes, and he flipped through the pages in a mixture of fear and horror. Each entry was filled with panic, despair, and growing madness. What he saw coincided with his own feelings, and he realized that there was no turning back. Later, at home, he tried to sleep again. Taking the diary, he put it next to him, thinking that it would give him confidence. But as soon as he closed his eyes, images appeared in front of him, almost the same as those described in the diary. His body was paralyzed, and it was as if footsteps were heard in the room. It became unbearably heavy in his chest, and with every minute the feeling grew that if he did not wake up, he would remain in this nightmare forever. The first rays of dawn brought some relief, but Frank wasn't ready to face another night alone with his fear. Having decided to take extreme measures, He began to record his own feelings, as his colleagues did. It seemed to him that if he continued to keep records, he would be able to somehow structure his horror and find a way to get rid of it. He recorded every detail of the nights, the sounds, the paralysis, even the sensations when he got up in complete despair in the middle of the night. But every day his recordings became more chaotic and intermittent. Frank started avoiding mirrors and refused to go outside. It seemed that now his life was passing in a state of permanent night, where even the light did not give a sense of security. He began to notice strange things behind him. Movements in the corners of his vision, strange shadows, and, what was especially frightening, the feeling that someone was watching him. One evening, sitting in his kitchen, he realized that he could no longer fight. He was overwhelmed by the realization that his consciousness was already subordinated to fear, and even if he fell asleep, he would not wake up the same as before. Frank slowly ran his hand over his face, trying to stop the trembling, but it only got worse. It was as if he had fallen into an abyss from which there was no way out. Every night, his mind was torn apart, as if someone was deliberately pulling out his deepest fears and plunging him into them, leaving him no chance to rest. In desperation, Frank contacted Detective Ellison again, begging for a meeting. Allison arrived quickly, as if he had already expected this call. He entered the apartment, looked around and, noticing Frank's exhaustion, tried to cheer him up. But soon, seeing the condition of his friend, the detective himself looked worried. "I didn't want to tell you this, but," Allison began, avoiding Frank's eyes. "We found something in the apartment of one of your colleagues, in the room where he spent his last days before." "Well, you know," Frank felt his hands go cold. "What did you find?" "Surveillance cameras. They were directed at his bed, at the windows, even at the entrance to the bathroom. According to the records, he hardly slept. Only short, anxious lapses into sleep, which were immediately followed by panic attacks. We don't know yet why he was doing it, but I think he was trying to find something. Or someone." Allison paused, glancing at Frank before continuing. "You have to be prepared for the fact that it might not just be fear. Perhaps it's something that has already destroyed his consciousness. We checked the camera footage, and they show movement, but it's not clear where they're from. Maybe it's just a figment of his imagination, but if you decide, I can arrange a similar thing for you." Frank hesitated, but something inside him made him agree. He wanted to get rid of doubts, even if seeing the terrible with his own eyes was better than living in the unknown. Allison brought the equipment the very next day and helped install the cameras. By evening, Frank already felt like he was in prison under surveillance, but a strange feeling of relief settled in his soul. Perhaps now he will find out what really happens at night. A few days have passed. Cameras recorded Frank tossing and turning, screaming in his sleep and sometimes getting up in the middle of the night, as if unconscious. But as soon as he woke up and sat down at his computer to watch the recordings, he was overcome with silent disappointment. Nothing. Just himself, trapped in a nightmare of his own fears. No sounds, no movements, just endless hours of his own terror. However, on the fourth night, he noticed something strange. In one of the recordings, Frank saw his own body suddenly begin to move in a way he had never done before. Muttering something barely audible, he gets out of bed, looks towards the camera and stops waiting. This moment seemed long, unbearable. He watched his own face, distorted by insomnia and fatigue, peering into the lens with some kind of painful interest. Then, as if waking up, he turns around and goes back to bed. Frank felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He was sure he had never done that. He was sure he had been asleep all night. Or didn't you sleep? The state could no longer be called wakefulness. His mind was wandering in a nightmare where he was hostage to his own fears. During the night, he woke up to a creepy sound coming from the hallway. A loud scratching sound, as if someone was trying to break through the walls. His hands were shaking involuntarily, but he decided to check, thinking it was just his imagination. However, the sound was real, It grew stronger and more assertive until it was replaced by silence. Frank felt his throat go dry. The silence was scarier than any sound. The next morning, he looked through the notes, again expecting to see nothing. But this time the camera in the hallway showed something terrible. Frank himself was standing in front of the wall, trying to tear it to cracks and blood with his own nails. He was looking straight ahead, as if he had heard something that required his actions, his attention. Suddenly, he realized that he would no longer be able to sleep, stay awake, or believe his own feelings. The next day, Frank realized that he had been in some kind of half-asleep nightmare for the past weeks, and decided to stop this horror at all costs. He came up with the idea to meet with the last specialist he had not yet visited, a well-known psychotherapist specializing in sleep disorders and hallucinations. Dr. Reynolds received him in his office, asking a lot of questions and watching his reactions with unusual interest. After an hour of conversation, Reynolds suggested Frank undergo an experimental procedure, something like hypnosis combined with sleep therapy. Frank, on the verge of despair, agreed. He settled comfortably on the couch, and the doctor began his procedure, soothing Frank with his voice. The doctor's words became quieter, and soon Frank was completely immersed in a relaxed state, losing touch with reality. When Frank opened his eyes, he found that he was not in the study, but in his own bedroom. The room was dimly lit, and it seemed unnaturally quiet. Confused, he got up from the bed and went to the door. When Frank opened it, he saw that he was not going out into the corridor of his apartment, but into the corridor of an unfamiliar room, which, apparently, was old, covered with a layer of dust and left unattended for years. He moved forward cautiously, feeling like every step was being watched. Dark rooms stretched past him, in each of which the shadows of his own nightmares seemed to flicker. In one room, he noticed a vision of Detective Ellison, who was looking in his direction with an eyebrow raised, and in another, the figures of his colleagues, who disappeared and reappeared like mirages. In fear, Frank looked back and realized that the corridor was closed, and the door from which he had left had disappeared. Suddenly, the lights came on in the room, and he heard a booming voice from a speaker in the ceiling. "Frank, you're in the project. It's part of the treatment that you weren't aware of." Frank froze. "What does this mean? Are you following me?" The voice continued, "This experiment is not simple. You and the other participants voluntarily signed up for it, even if you don't remember. Everything you saw was part of a simulation we created to study fear. You had a stronger reaction than the others. It turned out that the human mind is not really ready for such intense influences." He walked back to the wall, feeling his breath fail him. "What the hell? Why me? Why all this?" The voice paused for a moment, and then rang out again, now with a hint of regret. "Your story will serve as a new level of experiment. You've shown yourself to be extremely resilient. We will continue until you reach a state close to the limit. But don't worry, we'll always have the opportunity to start over." Frank realized that he was just a subject in a large-scale program, an experiment that led him to this state. A deep weariness gripped him, and he realized that all his struggle, all the horror he was going through, was just manipulation. He sat down on the floor and, feeling his consciousness slowly but surely leaving him, whispered, as if saying goodbye, "And what will happen now?" In response, he heard only a slight rustle and a phrase filled with cold. "Now your new cycle begins."